Hey, I want to begin by proving to you the total idiocy that I bring to the evening, because Nathan put before me a series of the questions that you're asking, and I'll show you the one that I chose. And the question goes like this. We know that God is good. The part I struggle with is, why does God let the bad things happen in the first place? Why do things like cancer, especially childhood, debilitating autoimmune disease, or extreme neglect and abuse of children even exist? So I chose that, again, from the place of extreme idiocy. Doing a lot of digging in and researching, I decided to change both the theme and the direction of tonight's sermon. I'd like to present an even greater tension, which is Jesus or puppies, great or greatest? And we'll go that direction tonight instead. So as we talk about and get into this very challenging subject, I want to suggest a couple of things. I'm going to frame the issue. Christians have been talking about this. People of all different types of faiths and religions have been talking about this type of question for centuries, and their answers are oftentimes unsatisfying. And so what I don't want to provide for you tonight is an answer and something that's buttoned up. I can't possibly do that. Hopefully we can have some dialogue that'll be a little bit more of a response to a really difficult question. So a couple things. If we were to talk about this question, we can really think of the concept of evil, or at least for the purpose of tonight, in three different ways. So the first one is those things which are an aspect of human free agency. I want you to think of September 11th. So evil as an act that is a direct consequence of a choice that a person makes, from the largest and most catastrophic of events to the most simple, in terms of the way I drive home, the way that I think or view or interact with another person. So we would talk about evil first and foremost as an aspect of the free will choices that people make. A second way we can think about evil is through the lens of natural disasters. So soon after September 11th, remember the Indian Ocean earthquakes and the natural disasters. So people oftentimes talk about this as if it's evil, but it's probably, for our sake, it might be better to say that which is tragic. The reason is it doesn't have human agency behind it, per se. We could probably agree that there's certain types of environmental factors that are going to be part of any natural disaster like this. But what we would say in general is that there's just certain things that are tragedy, and oftentimes they get lumped into this larger question of pain or suffering or evil. And so we can think probably about these tonight. The third source of all evil is sharks with frickin' lasers attached. So these are the three most common source of evil, and I'm only going to discuss the first two this evening. We will leave this other one for the side. So here's what I'm going to do. Three things tonight. This is going to be, I joke, but I truly believe that this will be an unsatisfying sermon to you. And I suggest that because, first of all, Nathan has only given me an hour and 10 minutes to preach tonight. And second of all, it is because a question of this nature deserves dialogue, and it deserves reflection, and it deserves relationship. So I'll offer tonight a response, but not an answer. And the third reason I think a sermon like this will be unsatisfying is it simply shouldn't be. A Christian on this side of eternity should never find themselves satisfied with any explanation of or discussion with the issue of evil or the tragic. Okay? So as we begin to talk, three things. One, I want to start, and I want to talk a little bit about a biblical promise that relates to this issue. Second, I want to talk about some unhelpful responses that might be familiar to you to this question, and then maybe end with a few, hopefully, more helpful responses. So the first is a biblical promise, and the biblical promise in response to this issue is that not understanding evil is actually a biblical promise. Truly, not understanding it is promised to us scripturally. So Isaiah 55 says this: "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." So there's a sense in which God is clearly articulating a sovereignty, an omniscience, and a knowing that cannot be possessed by human beings. The author, the teacher, the proclaimer of wisdom in Ecclesiastes picks up this same theme and says this in Ecclesiastes 8. "When I applied my mind to know wisdom and to observe the labor that is done on earth, people getting no sleep day or night, then I saw all that God has done. No one can comprehend what goes on under the sun, despite all their efforts to search it out. No one can discover its meaning. Even if the wise claim they know, they cannot really comprehend it. So you're used to like a biblical promise gets painted on some painting with like a unicorn and a rainbow, and we all memorize it, and it's like they sell it in horrible Christian bookstores, and this is not the type of promise that one would normally consider good news, but I think it's awfully fair. When I was younger, in fact, I think when I was on staff at TNL, at one point, in a sermon that I preached, I had this belief that I would say, what's the most common word that you will hear ever spoken in heaven? Oh, okay, now I get it. So that's how it works. There's this sense for me and for many that eternity represents fully knowing and understanding what can't be comprehended here. And I'd actually suggest that that's not promised to us either. There's nowhere in the scriptures that says that we worship an omniscient and all-knowing God, and that we spend eternity with him, for those who are his followers, spending eternity with him leads to them fully understanding and knowing. In fact, at this point in my life, I think I won't know and I won't care. And I think an understanding of eternity is I might not care about not knowing. And so I hold to a biblical promise that is a very difficult one, and that biblical promise applies to really common questions around this issue of evil. Let me suggest a few of them. Why did God create a physical world that could harm us? Why did he allow temptation? Why did God allow people to choose against him? Why did he allow the free will choices of those people to impact and create consequences on other people who were innocent of their decisions? Why doesn't God stop natural disasters? Why does God feel absent from evil and tragedy when it occurs? So I'm going to suggest that when we ask these types of questions about evil or the tragic, we're actually asking the same types of questions that Jesus asked. So if we remember the phrases, the last words that he uttered when he was on the cross, he faced a moment of this same type of kind of experiential tension. In Matthew 27, it says this. He trusts in God, this is the people were saying. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him. For he said, I am the Son of God. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over all the land. And about 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, which is Aramaic, and it means, my God, why have you forsaken me? So I think we might say that at the moment of the greatest evil in human history, the God-man innocent come to serve, come to set free, is killed and is ransomed. And at this moment, he asks the same type of question in the face of evil that we often sit with. And the response? The response is a loud and a deafening silence from the heavens. As Jesus hangs on the cross and he faces this moment of experiential evil, he asks the question, why, in the face of evil, and he receives a response of silence. And so I want to suggest that in this biblical promise, when we start to talk about these types of issues, we are promised perhaps nothing more than Jesus himself received in his greatest moment of pain in the face of his own evil. So I just want to suggest that God is actually silent on many of the most pressing questions we have about evil and about the tragic in the scriptures, and that's a response. But a really important quote, I think, from Christopher Wright. Christopher Wright is an Anglican theologian I really like, and he says, it's not as if God were saying, oops, I forgot to mention that point, all of our questions, but never mind, they can figure that out for themselves. No, the truth is that God has chosen in his wisdom not to give us an answer to our questions about the ultimate origin of evil within creation. It's simply not for us to know, and that's God's sovereign decision, the prerogative of the one who is the source of all truth and revelation in the universe. So I want to suggest perhaps a very unsatisfying, but a very biblically honest reality is that we are not promised an understanding of evil or many questions associated within the scriptures. And that that's not by accident, and it's not by oversight, and it's not by negligence in any part by God, but it's somehow within the sovereign mystery of God to extend to us the need to embrace a similar mystery. I told you I started at the very beginning with the declaration of idiocy. Why on earth would anybody want the unanswerable question? And I'm going to take this as confession, and I really mean this when I say confession. I was afraid of what another Christian would say in response to this. I was afraid of how somebody else might begin to answer and perhaps sit in the place of where God has decided to remain mysterious. This is a confession of my own difficulty and challenge and the doubt that I have experienced in my faith through the majority of my life. What is another Christian going to say? That's why I signed up for this stupid question. So I suggest that there's a biblical promise, but I think that there's also some unhelpful responses, and maybe you've heard some of these typical responses. The second half of the question that came in tonight was, actually, let's go back. Okay, there's a couple slides missing, no big deal. A response that came in as the second part of the question, it reads like this. To the original question, I've heard answers like, to bring us closer to God, or to test our faith. But doesn't that seem selfish of God? And I think it does. I think in the place of silence, have you ever met that type of person who can't actually handle the uncomfortability of silence, and so they fill it with conversation? And I think Christians are similarly this way. When we're faced with the silence and the mystery of evil in the scriptures, we begin wanting to fill it in because it's more comfortable to fill in with something than to sit with the bald and naked not enough, right? And so, doesn't this make God seem selfish? Yeah, actually, just a little bit. So I want to suggest that there's a difference between what God does in redemption of the evil and the tragic experiences of human reality, what he does in response to those, and causing them. And so, does God allow evil to bring us closer to him, to test our faith? I'd suggest that these are perhaps responses of God, but they don't explain, they don't fill in the blank. People will also say, well, why do good things happen to bad people? And they'll point to the fact that, well, isn't the earth cursed? In Genesis 3, we read that Adam and Eve have sinned and they've chosen apart from God, and God has cursed the earth. But there's an assumption here that somehow the curse is, big word, ontological, or it's that the curse is upon the whole of the earth, meaning after sin, the earth started behaving in a way different than the earth used to behave ahead of time. But I suggest most people, theologians over time, have understood that the idea of the curse to be one that's more functional, that there was now a frustration of the work of human beings. So I actually think the first act of redemption of God is to curse the earth. That there's thistles and thorns, and you'll work the ground by the sweat of your brow. That this curse was functional upon that place where human beings would experience labor, fulfillment of human purpose. That there was some frustration imbued into that place because people attempted to see answers to their own human value outside of God. But it doesn't suggest, the curse isn't like, well, the earth stopped being what it was earth and started being what it is now earth. Which is there was never any earthquakes, or as I used to say, there were never any mosquitoes before the curse. I don't know about the mosquitoes. They might have been around. But the point of this is, the earth is cursed is oftentimes an explanation for evil, and I'd suggest that it's not the most helpful response because it's not necessarily how we've understood the curse. Another response is really common, again, perhaps unhelpful, is that this is God's judgment. You should be really cautious and suspect. Anytime a person in the name of God begins making a public declaration in the response to that which is tragic or natural disaster, we should begin to be really suspect and just wait to hear that out. Because after New Orleans, after so many other situations, you hear, oh, it's God's judgment because of fill in the blank type of other thing. And the problem with this is simply that Jesus contends against it in a couple of different ways. Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus says neither, but that the glory of God would be revealed. Or there's a passage, and it's in Luke chapter 13, And he's referring to the fact that the political leader of that time had killed some Christians, that their blood was mingled with their own sacrifices. Somehow, we think that somehow that there was a political unrest and that people were killed in the act of worship. And so Jesus says, did you think that this was the judgment of God? Did you think that the people who were actually killed were somehow more sinful than others? He goes on and talks about another example. This is truly tragic and not evil, and this is that a temple or a tower of Siloam falls over and apparently has killed some folks. He said, did you think the people that were killed were somehow more sinful than those who weren't? And so I just want to suggest that when you hear this, why does evil exist? It's because of God's judgment. We at least have to suggest that Jesus contends against that aspect of theology. He doesn't give that explanation. In fact, he moves away from it. And so if in a number of different ways, this is maybe a diagram to help kind of capture this. There's a number of different ways that people will discuss the idea of evil. And I'd say if there is, you switch to the next one? Great. There's three things, and anytime three different things are being degraded, I'd suggest that this is an unhelpful response to evil. If in some way evil is less evil, it's not that big of a deal, this is an unhelpful response. If somehow the goodness of God is not still the goodness of God, this is an unhelpful response. And if somehow the sovereignty of God is not overarching, this is an unhelpful response. You can see the three of these held together in a couple different ways in the scriptures. If you go back and read the story of Joseph, and there's this wonderful passage in Genesis 50, where all of the pain that he had gone through, he basically says, didn't you understand that this was for the sparing of many lives? So somehow that there was clearly an evil that was done to him by his brothers, and so somehow, and yet at the same time, the sovereignty of God was over that, and he was still good. It doesn't justify this act, doesn't do anything else. And I'd say that the cross of Christ is another moment in which there's both utter evil and the pure goodness of God and his sovereignty overall. And so anytime a Christian response undoes any one of these, I'd say it begins to become an unchristian response to evil, an unchristian response to the tragic. So let me just suggest then, as a final thought, what are a couple helpful, if these are some unhelpful responses, what could be some helpful responses that the scriptures would commend to us? And so why don't you jump back and look for the slide on the helpful responses. Do you have that? Great. Helpful responses. I was originally, I'm going to give you four of them, and they're going to start with the letter G-L-A-D, because you need to be glad. No, I'm just kidding. I wouldn't do that to you. Okay. Because that would be horrid. But the first one does begin with G. So look, I'd say the scripture commends four helpful responses that we can consider. And the first one is that we gather. In Psalm 73, this is one of my favorite Psalms. If you've never read it, I would commend it to you. In Psalm 73, the psalmist is basically not asking questions about why do bad things happen to good people, but why do good things happen to bad people. So it's a reverse, but it's still sitting with the same tension. Psalm 73, verses 2 through 7 say this, "But as for me, my feet had almost slipped. I had nearly lost my foothold. For I envied the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. They have no struggles. Their bodies are healthy and strong. They're free from common human burdens. They're not plagued by human ills. Therefore, pride is their necklace. They clothe themselves with violence. From their callous hearts comes iniquity. The evil conceits of their minds know no limits." And so the psalmist is just basically lamenting, you can be a horrid person and not only get away with it, you can be a horrid person and prosper. And this is utterly confusing to him. But we pick up in verse 13, he says this, "Surely in vain," now he's reflecting on his own goodness in light of you can be evil and actually get away with it. "Surely in vain I have kept my heart pure and have washed my hands in innocence. All day long I've been afflicted, and every morning brings new punishments." Now, if I'd spoken out like that, I would have betrayed your children. I would have stopped being the people of God if I'd spoken out like that. Verse 16, "And when I tried to understand all of this, it troubled me deeply until I entered the sanctuary of God, and then I understood their final destiny." Listen, none of the psalmist's questions about the wicked actually made sense, and they didn't make sense to him until he enters the sanctuary of God, until he gathers with the people of God in a community something like this, in a worshiping and a believing community. And if you read the entire psalm, and it's beautiful, His immediate questions about evil are not answered. But he does have a reminder of what's, the immediate isn't answered, but he does have a reminder of what's ultimate as opposed to immediate. A friend of mine who goes to TNL, we used to ask, it stuck with me forever. It's actually Nate Galuzzi. We asked, what's the purpose of church? Like, why do you actually go to church? He said, well, because it reminds me of what I already believe. So it's not that I don't believe these things, but it just reminds me of what I actually believe. That there's something in the face of the tragic and there's something in the face of evil. That the people of God gathered is simply a response. It's simply a response. I would suggest this. Is it better to not understand and to be angry and to be alone? Or to do so with others having the exact same experience of anger and of not understanding? And this is why our churches are flooded after national disasters. People need to all go to a place to try to have some type of experience of understanding, and even if they're not met with understanding, they at least have an experience of communality, being together and they're not understanding. So I'd suggest that actually one of the responses to evil and to wicked, the people of God gather. But the reason they do this is because of a second response that is not as popular and known for us in the West that is in most of the rest of the world, and that is the idea of lament. Lament. That's okay, there we go. So the idea of lament. God actually gives his people permission to be sad. God gives his people permission to be angry. God gives his people permission to literally lash out at him in the face of wickedness and evil. And it's called lament. This is actually what this psalm is doing at the beginning of Psalm 73. The psalmist is lamenting, I cannot believe this. This is ridiculous. And so if you were to read this and a number of other psalms, I'd suggest Psalm 13 or Psalm 88 are two of them. If you'd read them, you're like, how on earth did that get in here? That doesn't seem like a right and a proper or a Christian response. How on earth is this in the Psalms? And the truth of the matter is there's actually more psalms of lament than there are psalms of celebration in the Bible. There's far more. And in that, I think it's a contrast to the way we do worship in the West, which is oftentimes celebratory. It's oftentimes, we praise God for things, but we don't oftentimes have communal rage, communal anger, or communal lament. So I just suggest that God did not include explanations for evil, but he did allow in the scriptures anger at him for evil. He didn't give explanations, but he said, you can be angry, and I'll give you a worship book to do it. You can be sad and you can grieve and be frustrated. I'll give you words to do it. So I'd suggest that as a helpful response, the people of God need to lament. We need to have a category of celebration. We need to have a category of lament. And if these two aren't wed together, I think we just have a disingenuous human experience. We're living simply an up and to the right vision of things always going well, and they don't. And tragedy happens. And we need to lament that. We've been given permission to. But we don't just say, hey, evil is evil, the tragic's tragic, let's just move on, scratch our head. There in other world religions, typically Buddhist or other worldviews, there's just this, we're going to excuse it. But the people of God are called biblically to resist evil, okay? They're called to resist evil. Romans 12:21 tells us that we are to overcome evil with good. So we're not ever commanded to understand evil. We're not ever commanded to just neglect it or just to deal with it or be patient in the face of it. But we are commanded to overcome it, to fight it, to resist it, and to renounce it. And I think this looks a couple different ways. I go to an Anglican church. And every time somebody gets baptized, the community gathers around and we renew our baptismal vows. Think of the wedding vows that happen in a ceremony. We actually, in the Anglican church, we have vows around our baptism. We renew them together. And every time somebody is baptized, we say with them upon their baptism these things. The pastor will ask, do you renounce Satan and all the spiritual forces of wickedness that rebel against God? And we answer, I renounce them. Do you renounce the evil powers of this world which corrupt and destroy the creatures of God? I renounce them. Do you renounce all sinful desires that draw you from the love of God? We answer, I renounce them. So evil is something to be overcome, and it is something to be renounced. As you read about everything that's happening at Michigan State right now, be outraged. Be outraged. And think about your internet history browser. Think about the ways that you walk down the street and objectify a human person with your eyes or in your mind. I want you to think about the way you've ever made any type of concessions on what's an appropriate ethic for one of us to relate to one another, and absolutely be outraged at the same time. So the way we actually speak against evil is we look at it interiorly and we renounce it and we live against it. But we also resist it in mission. I think there's two questions that sit around the idea of evil. We bring to God, we say, why? And I think his response is, what are you willing to do about it in my name? We say, why this? Why this? And I'd suggest that God is probably retorting with, and what are you willing to do about it in my name? So we resist evil. N.T. Wright says this. He was responding to the tragedies of the Pakistani earthquake, commenting on September 11th. He said, these events are a reminder that the problem of evil is not something we will solve in the present world, and that our primary task is not so much to give answers to impossible philosophical questions, as it is to bear signs of God's new world, to bring them to birth on the basis of Jesus' death, even in the midst of this present age. So it's not to understand them or to give a philosophical response, but to resist it and to give a signpost of what thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven is. And I'd suggest then, in closing, this is just as a final thought. As Christians, we are commanded to hope. I think Christianity is both the most pessimistic worldview, pessimistic about our own depravity, pessimistic of not everything is ever going to work out great, and it's the most optimistic of worldviews, in that evil is not the end of the story. The silent response of God is not the ultimate response. All of the questions going unanswered is not the full narrative in response to the tragic, in response to evil. But Jesus says, I've told you these things so that in me you might have peace. The promise, in this world you will have trouble. But take heart, I have overcome the world. We have this super amazing thing in the gospel. We say that the gospel is not just an individual being saved by grace through faith that they would spend eternity with heaven, though it must be, to be orthodox. But we say that somehow Christ is redeeming all things in Colossians. All things on earth and in heaven. And all things is an incredibly tricky Greek phrase, and if you study it, it means all things. It doesn't justify evil, it doesn't justify tragedy, it doesn't explain it, but he says that in this, there can be redemption, not just eternally, but also in this life. And so people look back and they say, still have no idea why this happened to me, but I know what God has done with it. I still can't explain what I experienced. I don't know why God let it happen, and yet I know what's happening in my life now because of it. This is a Christian vision of hope. This is a response to evil that simply flies in its face. And it says, this is not the end of the message. This is not the end of the story. And the narrative is larger than it's this moment in which we experience it. And so, friends, I just gave you a really unsatisfying sermon because the issue of the tragic and evil simply can't be responded to. But we can hope against it, and we can do so for the rest of eternity. So, let me pray for us to that end. Father, you promise that eternity is that which is no more tears, no more pain, the absence of evil. And we trust in your word. We hope in thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And pray that you give us the strength and the grace and the peace to order our lives around this. Amen.